we're going to pick up in Daniel 6 today. Last week we started and got the first half, or the setup, to probably the most well-known story in the book of Daniel, one of the most well-known stories in the entire Bible. Obviously, that's Daniel in the lion's den. And remember, last week we talked about how, at least for me personally, and likely for you as well, growing up when you were familiar with this story, how old did you picture Daniel to be? You say a teenager or at least a young adult. I mean, just not very old, but it's likely at this point that Daniel is 80 years old. So this is not a young guy. And he has been around the block many times over. He has been living in captivity under now the Second World Empire. He's risen to ranks within leadership. And so you remember, just for review's sake, when the book of Daniel started, what empire were we dealing with? So Babylonian, and their leader was King Nebuchadnezzar. And so Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians are gone. So now what empire do we have? Yes, so the Medes and Persians. So it's the Medo-Persian Empire, and their leader is Darius. All right, so Darius is in charge, and it's a big empire. Because this overtook that. That makes this even bigger now. And so if you got a really big empire, what do you want to do? You got to figure out a way to administrate something really big, so you're going to divide it into smaller sets. And so how did he do that? Yes, you remember we had these satraps. And how many were there? Do you remember? 120. So they're kind of at the so they would have had regions or territories or counties or whatever they would have called it. So you'd have 120 of them, and over them they were broken into how many groups? How many? 3. Yes, so you had 3 administrators, or sometimes some translations may call it a prefect, and so it's likely probably groups of 40-ish. So each of these individuals is responsible for a group of these, and then you've got the local territory that they're dealing with, and of course up here you've got the king. But there was one particular guy that becomes notable as being one of these administrators, and of course that was Daniel. So much so that the king decided, you know what, I think I might do what? Yeah, let's even promote him to prime minister. It doesn't seem that has actually happened, but the talks, the process, or whatever is involved in making that happen is in the works, such that the rest of these administrators know about it. And how do they feel? Do not like that. They're jealous. They think, who does he? I mean, why not me? Why not me? And so they decide, well, we need to somehow get rid of Daniel. And so if we can get rid of Daniel, then we're not going to constantly be compared to him. And no goody Daniel and all this nonsense. We'll be done with him. And even though they might not have said it to each other, the thought is maybe that one of us will get that gig. All right, so they decided we need to get rid of him. And so attempt one was to do what? I'm sorry? He said, get him to break a rule. Actually, the goal was to look and see what is a rule that Daniel has broken. I mean, has he crossed the line in some way such that we can go to the king and say, Daniel, the guy that you're thinking about making the number 2 is really bad. He's a lawbreaker, he's a horn blower, he's all of these, he's a jaywalker, he's all of these things. But as they are trying to come up with stuff about Daniel, what happens? They've got nothing. I mean, they keep scratching their heads, and they come up every time empty-handed, because Daniel is a guy that had a relationship with the Lord that affected every aspect of his life. And he was shot through with integrity. He was kind. He was dependable. He was trustworthy. He was everything. He's exactly the kind of guy that you would want to promote, that you could trust implicitly. And that kind of person doesn't really have dirt to speak of. And so they realize we don't have any dirt, and so if there is no dirt, what do we need to do? We need to make some dirt. We need to make some dirt. And so we need a compost pile of some sort and go from there. So their decision is, their plan is what? Yeah, so we need to create tension between Darius and God such that Daniel has to decide whether he's going to obey God or the king. And so it seems that they've paid enough attention to Daniel to know that among the things that Daniel does regularly is what? Daniel is a prayer. This is a guy that talks to his God how often? It's actually 3 times a day. So morning, noon, and night, he has set times, it seems, where he stops everything and he prays. They know this about him. It's very predictable about him. And so they go to the king and they say, "Hey, king, we've got an idea." And what's their idea? Yes, so for 30 days, what we need to make you, and we talked about this, so to make him not a god per se, but to effectively make the king like a priest, so that he would be the funnel through whom all prayers are directed. So if you need to talk to the god Molech, I mean, he becomes like the operator. So, get me extension 437 or whatever it is. And so he's going to be the guy that all the prayers for an entire month are going to be directed to or directed through. And failure to do so would result in what? Death. But not just any death. Lion's den. Which, you got to give them points for creativity. That's a pretty good way, a pretty intimidating way to incite desired behavior. Like when you compare lethal injection to lion's den, what do you want? I just want give me that go to sleep thing. This whole being eaten by a wild animal, just insanely unpleasant. That is a motivating thing. And so Darius hears this, and what's his feeling about that? He likes it. And why might he like it? It makes him important. Look at me. I am king. I'm essentially priest. Yeah, people they pay their taxes to me. They have to show respect to me, but now they're even directing prayers to and through me. And so that's very appealing to him. And so he said, yeah, I like that idea. And essentially these other guys, they've told the king a lie. They said, listen, we have all talked. So everybody within leadership has agreed. This is a good idea. So we're coming to you with this proposal. But does everybody know about the proposal? No, Daniel has no idea that this is going on. So they lie about this. They say everybody is on board and this is the plan. So what do you think? Oh, I think it's a great idea. And so then their follow-up is what? Yep, let's make it a law. So we just happen to have a draft here. All it requires is your signature. We went ahead, just in case you like this, we just wanted to be efficient with your time. If you want to go ahead and sign it. And I always get tickled how, like when Trump signs an executive order, he always holds it up. And I can imagine Darius at this point just holding this up with his fat signature on there. Look at this. What a great day for the Medo-Persian Empire. All the prayers are going to be directed to me. This is how, and so he thinks this is wonderful. And another thing that he probably thinks that makes this good is that it helps solidify his leadership over a unified empire. Because you got people that had been previously loyal to Nebuchadnezzar, and this is part of the process of breaking them and making sure that their allegiance goes from a previous gone leader to there's a new sheriff in town. All right, so they get him to sign the law, and it was really, really important for the king to sign the law. Not just to say, I like that idea, we're going to run with that. They need him to sign this law. Why? Yeah, because the Medo-Persian law, once a law is signed, you can't revoke it. You can't just say, oh, no, we screwed that up. We meant to make that September the 14th. I mean, if it says the 11th, it is the 11th. Whatever the day is, it is. Whatever the law says, it is. It is effectively to write in stone. So now, that leads us to verse 9 of chapter 6. That's where we finish. So King Darius signed the written edict. It is the law of the land, the unchangeable law of the land. All right, so let's read a little bit. Verse 10 says, "When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. These men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. 'Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den?'" So that's their question. Let's stop there for a second and think about what we just read. So Daniel has just heard about this. I don't know how he hears, but he hears. And he doesn't, it's interesting what he doesn't do. What does Daniel not do? He doesn't go to the king. And why do you think he doesn't go to the king? Why not go to the king? Going to the king is not going to do him any good, is what Tommy said. Would going to the king do him any good? No, why wouldn't it do him any good? It's the law. This is written in stone now. This can't be changed. The king can't just say, "Oh, my bad. Oops, I didn't realize that affected you in such an adverse way." There's no use going to the king. And so Daniel has a real problem now. And the first thing that he does is what? He prays about it. He prays about it. I get this. You get this. We all hopefully understand this. That regularly, in fact, let me back up to say this, that God has wired us for personal interaction. He has wired us for experiencing and valuing personal relationships, that we operate as part of families, we operate as part of communities, we operate consistently as things that are bigger than us. And we value that, we appreciate that, we like the personal connections, and the personal relationships that we have. And even though sometimes we lose sight of that, we understand when push comes to shove that those things are more valuable and those relationships are more valuable than any material thing that we can have. And God has wired us so that we desire interaction and we desire and value relationships with others, that we value people with skin on them. He knows that. He knows that. But those of us who have real and meaningful relationships with God, when we experience difficulty, that doesn't mean that we cannot and should not talk to anybody else about it. But let me ask you this. In your own experience, where has talking to God been on the ladder? Is it, I'm going to talk to my spouse, talk to my kids, talk to my coworkers, talk to my classmate in Sunday school, talk to my Sunday school teacher, talk to the preacher, talk to somebody, and somewhere along the way, finally, once we've essentially gone through the phone book, oh, by the way, yeah, maybe I'll pray about it. I just want you to consider that Daniel is a guy that is operating with flagrant, enormous, egregious hostility against everything that he holds dear. And when this guy has a problem where literally his life is on the line and there's the likelihood of him being dropped into the lion's den, he doesn't talk to anybody except God. I mean, the first order of business. Thank you. Aren't you glad you're 6 feet away? It's the zone of... I don't think it's the flowers, do you think? Anyway, there is the first order of business for him when he's got a problem is that he goes to the Lord. That is an invaluable lesson for us. And I think we need to actually pause regularly and say, all right, what's my order of operations? When I have a difficulty, where do I go? Where do I go? Who do I talk to? Who do I share this with? Who do I ask for help with? And I'm just telling you, if you think that a relationship with God really matters and that God actually has the power to affect your circumstances, let me just tell you, he should not be the last option. For Daniel, he's not the last option. He's not even mid-level. He's the first place that he starts. And so Daniel has this real problem, and he goes to the Lord, and it says, The windows, he goes into his house, the windows in its upstairs room open towards Jerusalem. And the fact that it talks about upstairs, so this is a multi-level structure, and it's likely that this upper room might have been, so if you have a home that's this big, a dwelling that's this big, that you might have just a singular room up on top of the building. Now, why might you want to have a room up on the top of the building? Well, not necessarily. I mean, Lynn said that everybody could see what you're doing, but maybe you got to be at the right angle. But what are the benefits of having a space like that? What'd you say, Grace? You could be alone. You really could get away from everything. Yeah, you don't have anybody above you. There's no distraction. But just in terms of comfort, what else might you experience? You can get a breeze up there. And so if you think about structures being built, I mean, especially if you're in a city, these buildings would have been close together. And so if all the buildings are essentially the same size, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, it's going to, in the day, as the temperature rises, it's going to get hot. And just to be able to get to a place, like he opens the windows, and why do you think he opens the windows? So he can get a breeze. Now, it is not at all, and I don't want you to think for a second that what Daniel does is to get up there and essentially get on like a siren. And I don't know, have you lived in places where the volunteer fire department had a siren that when a call would go out and then that loud horn? That is not what Daniel is doing. And if you think he got up there so that he could go, "Dear God, I'm praying to you," just to kind of wave his fist, he's not doing that. Why do we know this? Because the end of verse 10 says this is what he's doing is what he normally does. He's not trying to stick it to Darius. He's not trying to make a spectacle. It seems that this is his operation, his regular routine, that he gets this space that's all to himself, where he's away from distraction, where honestly, just even in terms of personal comfort, you can have a breeze, and he just prays. Because if you pray out loud, and like you're voicing it, you're not typically screaming at God, are you? I mean, you're just kind of talking. You're just talking. I think that's exactly what he's doing, and the fact that this structure has multiple levels, and that there's this upper room, it says something also about Daniel's position. Even though he is part of a conquered people, I mean, he's on the verge of being second only to the king. At the very least, he's one of under the king, one of three people that everybody in the empire answers to. So in terms of house, do you think Daniel's got a nice house? Probably got a really nice house. This upper room, probably a really nice upper room. Windows, he probably has the Anderson windows or whatever the insulated one. These are good ones, double hung. And so anyway, he got down on his knees and he prayed. It's interesting. It says he gave thanks to his God. Isn't that interesting that even with what's going on, he's thanking God, which even in that, there's a reminder to us that even on our worst days, even in our darkest moments, there's still stuff to thank God for. And that's what Daniel is doing. All right, so verse 11 tells us that these men went as a group. What men do you think it is? It's these, and maybe they've got a few of these others, though, too, just as conspirators. And why do you think they go to Daniel's house? They knew what he was going to be doing. And so Daniel has gone up there, and he opens the window, probably catch a breeze, but also that helps him orient himself, because what does he want to do? He wants to face Jerusalem, because what's in Jerusalem? The temple would be there. So we want to align with where that is, and just as a matter of personal habit, that's the direction that he would face as he would pray. But these guys go there, not thinking, I don't know, we'll just see what happens. I think they went feeling absolutely confident. We're not going to have to wait very long, because Daniel is going to do what we know he's going to do. And what we have done is created tension, so that he's got to decide between God and Darius, and we know what this guy's going to do. that he is going to side with God. And we are in a period of time and a period of change where our culture is getting more flagrantly hostile towards biblical faith, towards open expressions of godly commitment. You know, as a matter of practice, I'm aware of what's going on, and certainly it is the case that I have convictions and opinions and all sorts of stuff with respect to politics, but I don't preach politics. But there are various times where there is an intersection of what's going on in culture and what we see based on God's Word. But you've got Amy Barrett, who is being considered as a Supreme Court justice. And I don't know if you saw any of the video when, not during this most recent hearing, but back when she was considered as a federal appellate court judge. So to go to the federal bench for the first time. Dianne Feinstein, who's the senator, one of the senators from California, said this. And if you don't know anything about Amy Barrett, you've had your head in the sand. But this is a woman, even though doctrinally we're going to take issue with some of the stuff that she believes, but it looks like this is a woman that has a real committed walk with the Lord. I mean, that she takes what the Bible says seriously. And Dianne Feinstein said to her, and she's in that hearing, and these are her words, "Dogma runs deep within you, and that frightens me." That ought to frighten everybody that is a follower of Christ, because here you have officials at the highest level of government saying to somebody who takes this seriously, the fact that you take this seriously and that you actually believe it, that scares me. What I'm saying to you in short is that as time is progressing, we are experiencing, and you're going to see more of it, lots more of it. You're going to see flagrant pushback against you and against your commitment to what this says. And you will be castigated, you will be chastised, you will be all sorts of things. And the pushback is going to increase such that there will absolutely be times, if we each live long enough, I think it is likely that even here, there's going to be instances where we're going to have to decide whether I'm going to pay attention to what he said or what the government says. And if you say, I don't think that's possible, again, this is not an endorsement or an attack. This is what happened. I didn't watch it because I'm not watching any of it. I did read it. When you have a candidate for the presidency of the United States asked a question by a woman who says that their 8-year-old is transgendered, and they are told that an 8-year-old should decide what their gender is, we're operating where there's a problem for those that take what this says seriously. That's a real problem. And so what I'm saying is the heat is getting turned up, and it is going to continue to get turned up. And let me just tell you this, that should not surprise you, because if you go back here, let me just summarize this. It gets really bad before everything gets really right. So that's going to happen. That's absolutely going to happen. Don't let it catch you by surprise. But what we can do, what we should do, what we must do is to pay attention to examples like this where we say, you know what, it's possible I could get to a position and place where I've got to decide between what God says and what somebody in some position of authority and leadership is saying. Now, understand this, as a follower of God, God has instituted, but the Bible tells us where governments come from. Where do governments come from? All right, so governments and their leadership, it ultimately comes from God. And God has according to the Bible, that God has instituted governments and governmental authorities and leadership as a means of doing what? What does Paul tell us that they are established for? To restrain evil and to promote good. P-R-O, I can't even read my writing. It's always been that way. Back in the days of Darius, in the days of your parents, in the days of you right now, this is how it has always been. It's always been this way. So at the end of the day, governments aren't a bad thing. People operating in leadership, that's not a bad thing. God instituted this. God decided this. He's the one that's ultimately in charge, and He is instilled within the heart of humankind this desire to organize itself and to operate with leadership, because there's bad people doing bad stuff that need to get dealt with, and bad behavior. We need to have restraint on behavior, and we need to enforce consequences so that we're all walking peaceably in line, in coordination together. So this is a good thing, but it is possible that, evil can, historically there's been all sorts of evil rulers and evil governments. Even among the people of God, there were some just colossally horrible, evil, wicked, despicably bad individuals that rose to the position of leadership. And those that are subject to these governments, at some point and sometimes, because of the laws that are passed, you have to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to obey God, or am I going to obey this? And so as a follower of God, where should we be landing? Obviously we ought to obey His laws. Why? And part of the reason I put this on here is so that you can see that these are higher. That God, this is a higher law. God is a higher authority. There is greater accountability to Him than you'll ever experience to a king, a president, a governor, or whatever. And so if you find yourself where there is tension between what God has said and what government has said, we need to decide we're going to do what God has said, because at the end of the day, He's a higher law. In fact, beyond that, why, even at a more basic level, why should I pay more attention to God than what the government says? Well, He's our creator. When you think about that question, though, why should I pay more attention to God versus government? Think about the answer to that question in terms of consequences. In fact, Jesus said it this way. I'll give you a hint. Matthew 10:28, don't fear those who kill the body but are not able to kill the soul. Rather, fear Him who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell. What was Jesus saying? Do what? Well, what's the worst that government can do to you? The absolute worst they can do? They can kill your physical body. How many times can they kill you? Once. And once it's done, it's done. Hopefully we can agree that's not good. We're not looking for that. If there's a line where you can get into that says government kill me, don't get in that line. That's not a good line, right? But if the option is between that and the DMV, I get that it could be a tough decision. And so don't get in that line. The worst they can do is kill you. What can God do? You can experience an eternal death in hell. So this one, the death that they can bring, well, it may take minutes to hours before it happens, but then it's over with. What He can do has eternal consequence. Why should I pay attention to His higher law? Because His consequences are greater, and He can impose that which is exponentially greater than what any king, what any president, what any prime minister, what any government can do anywhere, past, present, or future. And so, bear in mind, it's getting worse. Don't let that surprise you. It'll get even worse, and it is likely, even here, that we are going to have to face choices, whether or not it is that we are going to yield to what God has said or to what government has said. Now, bear in mind that God has established this order. And so God views, generally speaking, government as a good thing or a positive thing. God views government as a good thing. So, as His followers, we ought to respect this leadership. We ought to respect those laws. And so long as it doesn't conflict with what God has said, we need to be law-abiding people. And it is possible. In fact, you're seeing some of this. I talked at some point early on about this. With everything related to COVID, there's all these questions about, and you've heard statements and people saying, well, religious freedom is being imposed on, and they're stepping on the rights of, the constitutional right to free assembly and to religion, and that's getting trampled, and the church is getting persecuted. Let me just say this. I believe that there have been some instances where in either at the state or the local level, there have been some instances where it seems that churches in particular were unfairly treated. I believe that to be the case, but I also believe it to be the case that there's been a whole lot of illogical things, irrational things that have been going on, and churches weren't the only groups that were treated with some lack of equity, where it was like, well, you can do this, but you can't do that. I mean, one of the examples I've given before, do you realize how long it took for bowling alleys to be able to open? I mean, it was a long time. I mean, it was just recently. And let's face it, if you say that you can only bowl with somebody that's in your family, I mean, your immediate group, and there's 2 lanes between you, couldn't you still open bowling alleys? Seems to me like you could. Because honestly, if something could live in those shoes, there's enough bacteria in those shoes to kill COVID and anything else. I mean, probably the cure to cancer is probably in those rental shoes at the bowling alley. But we're not saying, well, you know, the rights to bowl have been infringed upon. All I'm saying is, I believe that there has been, and there even in the District of Columbia, Capitol Hill Church had to go to court because they weren't even permitted to worship outside, socially distanced, with smaller crowds, with people with masks on. That's going too far. They went to court. They thankfully got relief from that, and so they've been able for the past 2 weeks to worship in person. That's really good. That's really good. So there have been some instances of that. I was going somewhere with this. I forget where it was. I got stuck at the bowling alley. Guess you could say my mind's in the gutter. Anyway, I do believe, though, and so that as time progresses, there will be not what, is that persecution or not? I think there is going to be some more flagrant persecution of committed expressions of following God. I believe that to be the case. I think it's certain that it's going to happen. And so we're going to have to make decisions whether or not we're going to obey God or man. Oh, I know where I was going. On some of this stuff with COVID, there have been some, not necessarily laws passed per se, but like, for example, on the state level, you've had some executive orders that have come down from the government that said, not just churches, but any group. So like you had this mask mandate. And some have said, well, that's infringing on my religious right. We've got right to free assembly, and we can come in here. We don't have to wear a mask. Like, here, at the end of the day, is it possible so that we can abide by what we have been asked to by government and still do what God has said? Well, if the answer is yes, if you need to make some adjustments, make those adjustments. Not any request or any demand or any limitation that government imposes. If you can adjust in such a way that you can still obey what God has said, well, then do that. Why? Because God has established this, and we ought to pay attention to it. All right. Well, let me speed up a little bit. All right, so they have caught Daniel. They were looking for it. They knew they would find it, and they absolutely did. And once they've got their evidence, I know they wish they had a tape recorder. Man, they would have killed for a tape recorder because they say, listen, we caught him. And so in verse 12, they go to the king and they say, I can't remember. Didn't you sign some stuff the other? Did you sign a law that said something about not praying for 30 days, any god or man except you, lion's den? Does that ring a bell? And the king says, yes. In fact, as a matter of law that can't be changed, it has been signed. It's irrevocable. So in verse 13, they say, Daniel, do they say Daniel has ignored you, or what do they say? What do you think they're doing with that? Well, they say Daniel, one of the exiles. Say it again? He's a foreigner. I mean, so they're trying to... They really hate this, desperately hate this. Maybe these other two are native Medes and Persians, and this is an outsider. This is, in fact, these have been doubly conquered, not only by the Medes and Persians, even the Babylonians conquered his people. Yeah, these Judean people. So, by the way, so anything that they can do to demean him, or what they think to demean him, they want to do. And so they're saying, he has ignored you, the king, the edict that you signed, and he prayed. They didn't just catch him once. They sat there and they noticed the pattern. Not once, not twice, but 3 times a lady, right? And so 3 times a day, he is doing this. That is flagrant. I mean, that's not, the speed limit is 45, and we caught him at 46. He's going 100 miles an hour, and he doesn't care. And so, verse 14 says, as soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. And if there was a period there, you may think that his displeasure is, Daniel is a guy that's trying to disrespect me. But the passage continues and says that he set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. So is he mad at Daniel? Is he displeased necessarily with Daniel? No, he knows that he's been hoodwinked, that he's been snookered, and he has signed this law, and Daniel is a guy that he likes. Daniel is a guy that he trusts, in fact, trusts him so much that he's willing to make him number 2 over the entire empire. This guy's a keeper. I don't want him going to the lions. It seems that there is this personal affability. Now, is Darius a guy that knows and walks with God? Certainly doesn't seem like it. And I think, well, there's no reason, I don't believe at all, to believe that Darius is a guy that has a relationship with God. But he cares for a guy who has a relationship with God. In that, there's a lesson for us. What do you think that is? I think it's pretty simple. We ought to operate in ways that even if people don't share our same commitment to God, we ought to operate in ways where we can still be loved by people that don't love Jesus. Right? And Daniel was cared for by the king, so much so that he spent the entire night, it's like he's gotten the law books out. Let's see, section A, let's see, if then, oh man, looking for a loophole somewhere. There's got to be some exemption clause somewhere in this massive book of law. Maybe somehow we can figure out a way so that I can say, oh, no, this doesn't include him. But he came up empty-handed. Verse 15 says, these men went together to the king and said, you know, your majesty, that it's the law of the Medes and Persian that no edict or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Do you think they said that respectfully or kind of snidely? I mean, to me, in my mind, I just hear it dripping with just, you know. What was that mean girl on Little House on the Prairie? What was her name? Nellie. I pictured, you remember, just nasty. This is how I kind of picture them. Just nasty. You know, your majesty. And so technically they're showing respect, but they're trying to box him in with the law that he signed. The king has no choice. The law can't be changed. And so the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. um, there are ways that we can say things where some of the people listening get one message and other people get a different one. And so I think it's possible that the king could say, "May your God whom you pray to deliver you," that some in this group would interpret that how? Well, that your silly little God, the one that you've been praying to, may your God deliver you. I think these in this group could interpret that way. But Daniel, somebody that's got a personal relationship with the king that is really cared for by the king, how do you think Daniel might have heard that? That it's sincere, and he's essentially saying, I hope your God delivers you. I really do. Now, the translation that you're looking at can render this differently. I think King James actually says that your God will rescue you. It is how the words are used. It is possible to translate it that way, but I don't think that's actually a good translation of it, because I don't believe that there is any reasonable basis to think that Darius is a guy that has a commitment to and a relationship with God. I don't think this is not a guy that's a believer, and so I don't believe and don't interpret this that he's got confidence at this point in God that he doesn't, I don't believe, actually have. So verse 17 says, so he's thrown down into this hole, this den of lions of some sort, and they put a stone over it, so that way you can't get out. And then it says the king sealed it with his own signet ring. And how they would have done this would have been essentially to take on either side, and sometimes even string was used, so that on the sides of this you would take soft moldable clay, and then they would use like the king's signet ring. And how many of those would there be? That'd be like one. And so there's no dispute. This is not somebody that is that has the king's handwriting, and they can. I don't know. I remember when I was a kid, there would be like when if you had a bad report card, and you still had to get it signed by your parents and kids that had learned how to write like that. This is not like that. So the only person that has this signet is the king, and so his ring would have impressed the royal seal on this. And so what does that ensure? Sealing this, what does this ensure? Well, no, it ensures that you can tell if it's been tampered with. So that somebody couldn't just come and roll the stone back. It's the same reason that when it talks about the tomb of Jesus being sealed, same concept. So that way you could verify nobody has messed with this. Nobody has gotten Daniel out and then dropped him back in just before he was looking. This thing was sealed with the king's ring, the king's signet. So there's no hocus pocus going on. And the end of verse 17 says that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. He's in there. It's sealed. The law is what it is. The sentence is what it is. And verse 18 says, the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. This is a guy, I don't know that he's fasting necessarily in a religious sense where he's like praying. I think it's fasting in the sense that what? He's just in knots. And you have experienced that. I mean, something is so weighty on your mind, you can't eat. And even if you tried to, you couldn't keep it down. And it says no diversions were brought to him. He could not sleep. I mean, it was a completely sleepless night. Verse 19 says, at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. So I believe that says something about how anxious he is to figure this out. But there was also a reason that it is believed that this is the case as well. It was true for the Babylonians, and it's believed that this was likely also true for the Medo-Persians, that if someone were sentenced, that they were sentenced to die or to be tortured in a almost certainly fatal way, if you did that and they survived to the next day, they would be pardoned. So that, for example, let's say it was hanging, and if you hung them but somehow they survived it, well, you just got your card stamped, and so you get another shot at living. And so in Babylonian culture, if Daniel would have survived that night, well, then he's able to be freed. It's likely that the same was the same was the case with the Medes and the Persians. And so he is going, probably in his mind, hoping against hope that Daniel is still around. And when the king reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lion's den? And again, this is probably posturing in front of these people. Oh, is your God? So what they are hearing is probably different than what the king actually means. He's really hoping that Daniel actually has a connection with a real God who has really been able to save him. And verse 21 says that Daniel spoke and said, may the king live forever. My God sent his angels and shut the lions' mouths. They haven't harmed me because I was found innocent before him. Him is not the king, innocent before God. And also before you, your majesty, I have not done harm. So I'm an innocent dude. Verse 23, the king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. Makes sense. He survived this. This is more reason why I was saying a moment ago about the Babylonians, and if you survive this, that you would be pardoned. I think that's what's going on with Daniel. He was brought up from the den. He was found unharmed, so he didn't have bite marks all over him. He hadn't just barely escaped with his life. He's untouched. And at that point, the king then gave the command, and those who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown in the lion's den, their children and their wives. In there, I mean, that's not. I'm not suggesting this is a good thing, but it is a reminder that our bad deeds, our choices affect not just us, but they affect others. And most often, they affect those that are closest to us, those that we value most. Their bad decisions not only cost them their lives, it cost them their spouses and their children's lives. And it says they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Why do you think that detail is included, that the lions got them? So that it confirms, Lynn said, so that we know that God spared Daniel. That these weren't just old lions that were full. Oh, I'm just not interested. They were ready to pounce, and they ate all of these. They destroyed all of these men and their families. So it's certain that they had the ability and the capacity to make mincemeat of Daniel. It's just that they didn't. Why? Because God intervened and God spared him. We're essentially done, but let me just give you 3 very quick thoughts. The question, in terms of application takeaways, how do you stand when there's every reason to fall? And Daniel had every reason to say, you know what, between God and the king, I'm going to compromise. How do you stand when there's every reason to fall? The first thing you got to do, God has to be your primary go-to. God has to be your primary go-to. We saw that at the beginning. The first person that he talked to was not a friend. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a preacher. It wasn't anybody. He talked to God. If you want to stand when it's just particularly difficult, it has to be that your pattern is God's your primary go-to. Secondly, your faith must be an essential business. Your faith must be an essential business. We have been hearing over the past period of months about there are essential workers and essential businesses. And so even when a lot of stuff was closed, for example, grocery stores were still open, right? But Hallmark wasn't. I don't think they were. Is Hallmark an essential? I know it's not essential. I don't know. Anyway, that your faith must be such that you can't, I'll just turn it off. You know, if the government says I shouldn't do this, I'm just not going to. But if you're going to stand, and if you're going to be a person like Daniel, your faith, your walk with God has to be essential business. It doesn't make any difference what else around is going on. This is still going to be going on. And the last thing is you need to have a contagious faith, that you ought to have a faith that others know about. And whether or not it is that they wind up accepting it for themselves, they ought to be aware of it in such a way that they have to make their own decision. If your faith was a cold, If your relationship with God was a cold, would anyone else have the sniffles? Well, if not, in truth, for each of us, there's some stuff that needs to change, because having a faith that can withstand opposition is a faith that will impact others, that will be, by definition, contagious. We got through it. I didn't know if we were as slow as I was going at the beginning. Thank you for being here, and let me pray and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for giving us this chance to walk through this passage, and there's been things that we've been able to observe, principles we've been able to think about, ways that we could possibly apply what you've said, but none of that matters unless we actually do it. We are operating in an environment that is increasingly hostile and will, over time, get even worse. I pray, Lord, that we take seriously this whole prospect of following and living for you, even if that puts us at the end of, or the ire of, or the business end of government's laws, where if we are called upon to compromise our faith, that we realize we answer to you. We answer to higher authority, and to no one are we going to bow except ultimately you. So thank you for giving us this time. I pray that we learn and we live these lessons in Christ's name. Amen.